Hey everybody, KC here. So one of the things I like most about my job is I learn stuff every day. For example, a number of years ago, I used to do a lot of writing about the Food Safety Modernization Act, right? FSMA. But it sort of fell off my radar. And it's only recently that I learned that FSMA has Rule 204. And Rule 204 of the Food Safety Modernization Act requires the FDA to designate foods for which additional record keeping requirements are appropriate and necessary to protect the public health, right? And and you read the description of what Rule 204 is in the Federal Register, and oh my God, it goes on and on and on and on, as you might expect. But the thing is, it's not just bureaucratic hooptedoodle. It's the foundation for traceability regulations that are going to begin being enforced late next year, and that could, once they're being enforced by an FDA that is more activist now than it used to be, could actually create a real existential threat to the food industry in terms of trust, in terms of fines, and all sorts of things. Now, the way I understand it, and I've talked to a number of retailers about this, a sizable percentage of the food industry isn't really prepared to comply with Rule 204. Not because they don't have information, but because it's not consistent, it's not accessible, and it's generally not shared, right? It tends to be isolated in silos, which is sort of typical for the food industry. But now there's a concerted effort to address the problem, right? And it's called the Food Traceability Leadership Consortium, which was specifically designed to create a traceability network that'll meet the demands of the FDA. It's very, very simple. So I recently had the opportunity to spend some time via Zoom, right? Still doing Zoom, with members of the consortium. And they included Chris Gindorf, who's the Senior Manager for Food Safety and Quality at Lund Food Holdings, Jennifer Crandall, CEO of Safe Food En Route, and Randy Fields, Chairman and CEO of Repositrack, which has engineered the technology that's going to power the Traceability Network. Now, full disclosure, Repositrack has been a Morning Newsbeat sponsor, but I thought this was a really important story, and I didn't think the fact that they had sponsored Morning Newsbeat in the past, and listen, hopefully will in the future, I didn't think that was a very good reason not to do this story, because I think it's a serious story that retailers and suppliers need to pay attention to because they have to meet the demands of the FDA. So, well, our conversation is extensive. I hope you find it illuminating. Enjoy. Jennifer, Chris, Randy, welcome to Morning Newsbeat. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So the reason we're having this conversation, as I've sort of just explained to the Morning Newsbeat audience, is something has changed on the regulatory front that has created a new demand on retailers. There's something they have to do now that a lot of them, and not just retailers, suppliers, there's an issue they have to address or they could be in trouble. So Jennifer, why don't you just start and tell us exactly what's changed?
Well, this is the first time that they are required to provide certain key data elements, they call it KDEs, to that pass from one entity to the next, all the way through the supply chain. And normally it would just be passing it to the next entity. So now it requires that the entire supply chain has the same consistent data to be able to share to the FDA on demand. Basically, we have to turn it around in 24 hours according to what the proposed rule is at this point. So it's a lot of data to be exchanged back and forth. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that the whole industry has to face, because it's the first time ever we've had to provide that type of data up front upon request.
Chris, from a retailer point of view, let's drill down on that a little bit. When you say data, what does that mean? I mean, so that we have a supply chain, there's tons of data going back and forth between retailers and manufacturers. What exactly does the FDA want that it does not have access to now?
I don't know if it's so much the access as it is the consistency of the elements that are being tracked. So we are primarily looking for lot code traceability, item descriptors, quantities, all those elements, those key elements, as Jennifer referred to, that there's been so much inconsistency in that path that it's made it difficult to have a full traceability view throughout the system, going from retailer all the way back to the farm.
I'm going to betray my naivete here. I'm just a pundit. Lock code. What are lock codes? What you just used a lot of terminology there that I don't understand. I'm assuming most people in the industry would, but just in case, put that in English, I guess is the question I'm asking.
So obviously, just from that request, there is a lot of different descriptions that we could put into that, what that lock code actually means. So for some, it could be a Julian date of 169, the day of the year. It could go up to a 16 element GTIN number that's associated on a UPC code. So everybody has their own unique identifiers for a product, and that can make the system more complex.
What is the FDA? What are they trying to find out here? What are they trying to ascertain? Is it about food safety? Is it about provenance? Is it about what? Randy, what is this? You get very heavily involved in this.
Well, for many years, there's been a concern at the level of the FDA and frankly, the industry, that when there is a food safety event, an occurrence, there's an interesting problem. The problem is, where did it come from? How did it get here? Where else is it? One of the co-founders of our business, Mike Levitt, used to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. So the FDA reported to him. And we had hours of discussions over what would happen. The FDA would have a war room. They would start printing out sheets of paper that sort of describe where they think the product came from. They would pin those to the wall. And the next thing you know, people would leave the room, get on airplanes, and start flying around America or the world to go back to the next step and figure out, well, we know it came from you. Where did you get it?
Right. And
so on and so forth. So the records were, just as Chris said, inconsistent, difficult. Even the name of the product didn't make any sense. One guy called it Tom's Tomatoes Farm called it My Medium Reds. The packing house called them Romas. And then by the time it got to a retail store, five levels later, it had yet another name. So even the, if you will, the synchronization of names was difficult. So what happened was, this was originally part of the Food Safety Modernization Act,
right,
that high-risk products would be tracked and traced and all of that wonderful stuff. Well, that was great, except for the technical and economic problems associated with doing it. So it was pushed off to the side, nobody's fault. And then the FDA got sued. I can't remember exactly who, but it was a citizens group, the same group that worried about McDonald's cooking French fries in the wrong oil and killing us all. But a citizens group, I think the state of California, don't hold me to that, right, filed suit to force this idea of tracking and tracing. So while all of us are in the middle of a pandemic and trying to keep toilet paper on the shelf as retailers and wholesalers, the next thing you know, the FDA announces this dreaded Rule 204, asked for public comment. There was not a lot, to be candid, because everybody was preoccupied during the pandemic. And now we're up against something's going to happen between now and next November in terms of what that's going to look like. So
November 21 or November 22?
22 could happen anytime between now and then, but something is going to happen. It will not be nothing, it will be something.
So Jennifer, you spent a lot of your career at Kroger, which is an enormous company. Chris, you're at Lunds Byerly's, which is not a large,
28 locations.
Right. But are the challenges different from a retail perspective, depending on size, or does that matter less than the technology that you're using to track and trace?
I think it's a combination, right? So And I've been on both sides of the fence, being a supplier to the retailers in my manufacturing days, and then also doing some of the retail work on the other side. What I've noticed is that legacy systems for the larger companies get in the way as they start to develop their software platforms that they're using, and they continue to do mergers and acquisitions. They tend to have disconnect in their data. And this is across everyone, right? So it's not just the retailers, but even the businesses that are growing and are starting to tack on SAP systems. They don't have that consistency of data. So they run into some of this same stuff that Randy just described, where they might have even name discrepancies, spacing, periods, all the software challenges. The other side of it is the size of a retailer, and I'm not sure about Chris's position, but the size of the retailer and the number of suppliers. So a huge challenge, and I've had this conversation with Randy's team a few times. A huge challenge is what I call like the supply chain communication trap. And you have, and produce industry is a great example, and the situation that Randy just described about the tomatoes. Let's just go back to romaine lettuce or to spinach when we had the massive recalls in the last decade, and we couldn't even identify who it was. So it like wiped out the shelves because we didn't know who to recall. So it was like, fine, we don't know what's going on, recall everything. Let's wipe off the shelves. Well, in the background, what was happening was exactly how Randy was describing it, trying to figure out who is who's causing the problem, finding the lot code that was affected, how many lot codes were affected. And this happens in every single recall situation that exists. Going back another decade, you can take like Peanut Corporation of America, whenever that exponentially started changing because we found out that the peanut butter was in so many different products and as an ingredient. So then you had to go back and trace it. So that's why the high risk ones are such a more important to be tracing. I'm sure Chris has other things that he'll add from his perspective, but that's just kind of my quick synopsis of it.
You just gave me a flashback. I'd forgotten all about the Peanut Corporation of America. I was going to say cluster, something that was, because
Yeah.
because it ended up they were doing what wasn't the story that they had feces on the equipment, and it ended up their peanut butter was everywhere.
Yeah.
And nobody even knew it. Their peanuts were everywhere, and people didn't even know it. I mean, so is that, in a very simply put, is what you guys are working on? It's this Food Traceability Leadership Consortium. Is it designed specifically to address that issue? So you know where everything is from the very beginning, right to the point that it gets to the consumer. Is that the basic goal here? And you're nodding.
Randy's nodding.
This is video and audio, Randy. But that's the goal.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So that
we have to embrace we have to embrace that transparency in order to overcome and to meet these regulations that are coming down the pike. That's exactly what they're asking, is that transparency, and everybody's afraid of transparency. Like what if I share too much?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, because the romaine issue you brought up, I mean, it was like, it seemed, again, maybe it was just my impression, but it seemed like months there was no romaine on the shelves because they couldn't figure out where it came from.
Right. And then company, like what I noticed, and I had a lot of connections in my network. I had, that was coming out of like Yuma, Arizona. The FDA finally traced it to Yuma. The Florida companies that were producing romaine were affected, and they could not sell their romaine lettuce. That was fine. There was nothing wrong with it, but the whole country was afraid of romaine lettuce at that point.
Even in Minnesota, where we had the indoor growing houses were affected by this, which we knew that this wasn't going to be a part of that case because it was a national issue, not just a state of Minnesota issue. Yet we have to make that call just for public health.
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting point because I just came back from the Organic Produce Summit, and there was a lot of conversation there about organics and then organic aquaculture kind of stuff. And there's so many different ways of growing product today. And if you know I'm making it up, I don't even know if you can do this, but if you're growing romaine lettuce in aquaculture, via aquaculture, you're clearly not going to have the same issues you would have if it's being grown in dirt. And so, but the idea that that would be hurt as well, it makes no sense. So this is actually, and you know, I think Jennifer, you just said that there's a that the industry has traditionally been afraid of transparency, but in this case, it's a really good thing. This is good regulation as opposed to specious negative regulation. Is
Right.
that fair?
Yeah, and the proactive approach that the industry took to respond to the romaine outbreak, they started putting the location, the state of where the product was harvested. Some were putting where it was produced, and some were putting where it was harvested, depending on how the product was handled. And so that was a big adjustment and a voluntary thing that the industry did. I don't believe that the FDA pushed for that, but that's what the traceability rule is going to be pushing for, is that they start requiring that kind of transparency as well.
And to be clear, Rule 24 is this is what this is basically. This is following through in terms of enforcement on rules that have actually existed for a while. They're just enforcing now. This is not a new in the last 6 to 10 months kind of thing.
Well, this is actually new. Rule 204 just takes what was previously there, which was the requirement was to have traceability one step forward, one step back, which I think, you know, that's fairly easily manageable. It's for us at the end of the chain as a retailer to go all the way back through all the distribution channels for the other manufacturers down to the farm to be able to connect all of those systems together. That's where it becomes a really huge task and asking. So I guess, you know, I'm happy that we're on the front end of this so that we can address this before the 2-year compliance period comes due. But to tack on to what Jennifer was saying earlier, so we have a couple commissaries here for Lenz and Byerly's that, you know, so we're also a manufacturer and we're basically a supplier to our own retail stores. So now the complexities become that much greater. So we're dealing with small, local, as well as national brands, and to be able to track and trace all of that is, yeah, it's going to be a task.
And to be clear, when compliance kicks in, the requirement will be that whoever's it will. Let me ask it. Will it always be the retailer who gets the request for information, or will they also go to supply? They can ask for information from anybody.
Anywhere.
I think it'll go anywhere. Yep.
And the requirement will be that you'll have to come up with the information in 24 hours.
In a sortable spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Electronic or otherwise.
Digital.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So amazing, because I mean that's, and it's extraordinary. And I can imagine that in the independent sector, even more than the large chain sector, you know, that would be incredibly difficult, because some of these guys have like 9 different systems working in different parts of their companies, and there's very little. There's you know, the Venn diagram is something out of Picasso. I mean, it's really bizarre. So okay, so hence this Food Traceability Leadership Consortium. So talk a little bit about that and what your goal is in terms of sort of disseminating this heightened consciousness, if you will, around the industry.
Well, so the FDA came out with the invitation to anyone to come up with a low cost, no cost solution to be able to provide a platform to gather all of this data and put this all together in this sortable spreadsheet. And there are so many different options out there available to us, but not all of them address the entire food chain. And so I think that's where we got together to figure out, you know, we're already collecting a lot of this data. Our suppliers are collecting it. They're getting it from downstream or upstream, depending which way you look at it. But how do we tie all these things together? Somebody's already collecting this stuff. So how do we just put it together in an easy format?
So basically what happened is they said it can be no cost, low cost, and it has to be the entire supply chain. And Randy, that's where you said, I can do that. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, exactly right.
So talk a little bit about what you're doing with this consortium to sort of develop a solution.
Well, I think as both Chris and Jennifer pointed out, a primary problem that needs to be solved is that everyone has some data in the supply chain. They have it their way. And now you've got, I call it the Burger King problem. You've got data in some format. You will now need to send some of that data to someone else in your supply chain, typically a customer. And in what format do you send it? You put it in an email? Do you put it in a bill of lading? Do you put it in an ASN? Where do you put it? And it's not up to you where to put it, if you think about it. It's up to your customers to where they want you to put it. So if you are a Lunds Byerly, or if you're a Kroger, let's take the case of a Kroger. I'm going to guess Kroger has 1,500 to 2,000 suppliers that will have to send this kind of information under Rule 204. Where do they send it? To the chairman? Do they send it in an envelope? How do they send it?
That would be a surprise for Rodney McMullen if suddenly he got all these envelopes.
Exactly. And by the way, that's not,
and
it's not like, it's not like that data comes once. It comes every time there's a shipment.
Yeah.
Right.
So we estimated, let me quantify this. We estimate that a chain of 100 stores, not a huge chain, kind of a regional chain of 100 stores, will have around 5 million data points that end up inside their wherevers. It's worse. Even if they get spreadsheets, we think that a typical 100-unit chain will end up with 15,000 spreadsheets from their suppliers over the course of a year. Now, just ask yourself the question, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
Where does it go? And it's worse than that because, as Chris pointed out, a sortable spreadsheet. Okay, let's look at that. In column 1, do you put the date? Well, in mine, I'm going to put the date in column 1, but I go to, I'm the supplier. I send it to Kroger. Kroger says, dude, we're the customer. You cannot put the date in column 1. The date has to be in column 3. The product identifier has to be in column 1. Well, if I have 50 customers, every one of them is going to want data their way, Burger King style.
So basically what the industry needed and what the consortium was set up to do is to kind of create an organizing principle or an organizing platform with sort of a, with some level of consistent intelligence sort of imposed upon it. So everybody's singing from the same hymnal.
No, it's actually the reverse of that. Let me explain. It's tricky. We realized we can't get everybody to do something in common. Everybody's going to do a spreadsheet their way. Everybody's going to collect data their way. Everybody's going to store data their way. What was needed was an infrastructure, which we've had for 20 years, that could take data any way that someone's got it and harmonize that with how their customers want it. So in a sense, we're sort of a data exchange. We're like the United Nations. The guy at the front can be talking Farsi, but we'll translate it into 120 different languages that everyone else in the supply chain needs. So go ahead.
So if Kroger or Lunds Byerly's or anybody for that matter, suddenly if they're part of this consortium and they get a call from the FDA saying, hey, listen, we got an issue with that lettuce. The idea is they reach out to you and you would instantly put that, you can take whatever information they've been providing to you to put it in a format that is then going to be acceptable based on the FDA regulations.
Actually, we're going to go past that.
Okay.
We think that, and we could be wrong, but I think the general feeling of the consortium was, this is a stake in the ground for the FDA. This is not the end, this is the beginning. And so over time, they're going to want more products covered and what we call an electronic pedigree associated with a product. So we're actually going to do that, meaning at the click of a button, Kroger or Lunds literally should be able to see the entire pedigree of that product laid out from farm to fork everything they need to know about it, deliverable in a sortable spreadsheet or any other format to the FDA.
And to tie into that,
Yes,
I would agree with you, Randy, that this food traceability list was created from the items under evaluation of highest risk and consumption.
Right.
So things that were tied together like romaine and E. coli or listeria with
Yep.
cheese,
Yep.
those high risk foods, I think once this is launched, it will continue on, as Randy said, it'll encapsulate every food product in time.
What
Yeah.
product, Jennifer, what product categories are going to be covered in the first, as of November 2022?
Yeah, I have to reference it, so hold on. So
All
there's cheeses and hard cheeses, shell eggs, nut butter, cucumbers, fresh herbs, leafy greens and fresh cut leafy greens, melons, peppers, sprouts, tomatoes, tropical tree fruits, and then fruits and vegetables that are fresh cut. That's
So
largely not
just
the full list.
So largely fresh. We're not getting into the CP.
Largely fresh. Peanut butters fall. Any of the nut butters are falling in there, but yeah, everything else is pretty much, and the cheeses.
Retail deli salads.
Yes.
So, but ideally, not ideally necessarily, but conceivably, in by 2023, 2024, whenever, this could be expanded to say, hey, listen, we had a bad batch of Oreos that went out. We've got to be able to figure out where whatever is in an Oreo, you've got to be able to figure it out. Soup to nuts. I'm mixing my metaphors.
that's a good
Right,
way
but
to say it.
that's the thing.
Yeah, and let's be real though. So like, not just the regulatory requirements, but think about marketability for the supply chain.
Mhm.
And to me, I've been saying it because I'm very intimately familiar with the foreign supplier verification program rule. That's what I launched my business on. And the importers and that kind of background, like I've been trying to sell this to everyone. It is more marketable for you to have best in class practices and procedures, and tracing all your product is part of that. Like it's not that, and a lot of companies will say, I have a great traceability program. Where is it? It's on a piece of paper in your file cabinet. It's not digitalized. So I think some of the challenges that the consortium is going to run into, and that the industry in general is going to run into with this, is still convincing companies that you need to take that piece of paper, you need to scan it somewhere, you need to put it into a digital format, and then Randy's solution can digest that information, be able to disseminate it the way it needs to be disseminated. But it's really, that's one of the biggest challenges, is the supply chain needs to step up faster, and they're not fully prepared. I will say, I know they're not, because I work with the smaller guys all the time, and the small companies just aren't there mentally or financially. So kind of coming back to needing a low cost solution, this is a good alternative to be able to do that, but they still have to take that leap of faith to digitalize.
If we're talking about carrots and sticks, what is the stick here? What do we know? What the penalties will be if you get it to the FDA in 25 hours versus 20? I mean, what do we know? What the penalties will be?
I don't know if I could answer that. I wouldn't want to dare speak for the FDA. I can tell you what's happened with, like,
I mean, is it fine? But it's financial.
Yeah,
you're going to get fined.
There are financial penalties. There's criminal penalties associated with the Food Safety Modernization Act and that rule, and they're putting a lot more liability on companies that has never been there before. The FDA has a lot more jurisdiction than they did.
Yeah, and I would venture to say that the FDA will continue to be helpful in the areas of education and helping us get to where we need to be. But it is our responsibility to have this transparency and the traceability to its fullest extent, because as I've always told our local regulatory agencies, we are both entrusted with public health, and to just ignore this is not going to look good for either one of us. So the sooner we react.
It's not good for the brand.
Well,
have a recall. That's terrible for your brand.
Right.
Absolutely.
But also, to wrap this up for a second, I also think that at some level, I mean, this is also an opportunity for retailers at the retail end. I mean, if you know where products come from, and you can actually start to develop a story out of that. right? And you can develop a narrative
Mhm.
so instead of it's being, oh my God, it's that romaine from Tucson or wherever, you can start to tell a story about the farms where these products are being made, and you can tell really good news stories
Mhm.
about these products. I can remember, decades ago when I was in Ireland, and Super Quinn would have signs over the fish department saying, this is the guy who caught the salmon. And in the produce department, they'd show, this is the guy who grew the tomatoes. And that is not just playing defense. That's actually using this stuff to play offense. And that's a good thing for retailers to do.
Absolutely. Kroger's already been doing that for a long time, as well. And the things that I saw with the suppliers that were more transparent, they were getting more time in front of the customers. So they were getting more marketing, and if they were giving them the story, they sell their story a little bit more. And the other thing I'd like to tie into it real quick is the just from a food waste and a sustainability piece of this, because go back to the spinach and how much spinach was thrown away, how much romaine lettuce has been thrown away because it was deemed not edible, but it really was because it was a different lot code, or it was from a different region. So this also can help us with food waste issues as well.
So is there a consortium website? How do people find out more about how to get involved and what they need to do? Anybody?
Randy.
Yes, actually, we have a web page on this traceability initiative on the ReposiTrak web page. Let me add one thought, because many of us in this industry tend to think quarter to quarter or even less, given the current supply chain. If anybody's old enough to remember seatbelts and automobiles, no one fought safety harder than the automobile manufacturers when the idea of seatbelts was brought forward. And now they sell cars on the basis of safety. They've come some distance past just seatbelts. So clearly safety is marketable. Clearly not destroying your brand and recalls is a good idea. Independent laboratory tests prove that. The fact of the matter is that I was surprised in one of the early meetings of the FTLC. I was flabbergasted. The question wasn't, well, how sure are we the FDA is going to do this? The attitude was, look, it's coming someday, some way. Let's just do it. I mean, what's the point? If it's cheap enough and easy enough, why would we resist it? It's absurd. Yeah. So the industry has changed in the last few years from what we can see, from being resisting, digging their heels in, to, look, if we can find, and certainly that's why we've offered one, an inexpensive, easy to do way to do this, what would be the reason for not doing it? So I
will put a link to the relevant website at the bottom of underneath where we're talking right now. And I have assiduously avoided allowing this to become a commercial for ReposiTrak, which is engineering all this. However, I would be remiss if I didn't ask Randy, how much are you going to charge retailers to get involved with this?
Zero.
Okay. And how much do suppliers have to pay?
Okay, remember the FTLC set out a series of principles as a challenge. And the first was the cost through the supply chain had to be so low that it couldn't impact consumer prices or margins. That's a pretty low number.
Right.
So what we've decided to do is to allow the unlimited use of our network to do this, to store information, forward information to customers. And the total price is $179 a month for a supplier.
No matter how many brands they have.
We don't care what they do. It's actually by facility, because that's how track and trace is done. But most suppliers have a single facility, which means it's $179 a month, unlimited use.
And zero for the retailer.
Zero for the retailer, zero for the wholesaler, and zero for the wholesalers' retailers.
Right. Well, listen, this is extraordinary. I was always interested in the Food Safety Modernization Act when it first started to become a topic of conversation a number of years ago. It's really interesting to get this sort of update. I know we could probably talk for another hour and delve deep into it. Maybe we'll come back and do that at some point. But for the moment, Jennifer, Chris, Randy, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.